"Did you really wrap this in newspaper, Margaret?" my daughter-in-law asked at the Christmas table while everyone else tried not to laugh. I looked down at the small package in Vanessa's perfectly manicured hands and gently folded my napkin across my lap before taking another sip of lukewarm coffee. Outside the dining room windows, snow drifted quietly across the front yard of the Ohio house my husband and I had bought 43 years ago, back when this neighborhood was still mostly farmland and old maple trees. The Christmas lights hanging along the gutters reflected softly against the glass, warm and golden from a distance, but inside that dining room, everything felt cold. "It's vintage newspaper," I said calmly. "From 1978. Richard used to love reading the comics in those Sunday papers when he was little." Vanessa exchanged a look with my son Daniel, and he lowered his eyes toward his plate almost immediately. That hurt more than her laughter ever could. My grandson Tyler snickered under his breath while reaching for another dinner roll, and Emily, sweet little Emily with her father's blue eyes, stared at me with obvious discomfort from the far end of the table. I carefully smoothed the wrinkled edge of the wrapping paper between my fingers while Vanessa peeled it away dramatically, almost like she was opening a joke gift at an office party instead of something made by a 72-year-old woman who had spent weeks putting it together. "Oh my God," she laughed. "It's a snow globe." The room filled with those polite little chuckles families use when they don't want to seem cruel, but also don't want to defend you. Vanessa turned the glass globe upside down, watching the tiny flakes drift over the little hand-painted farmhouse inside. "This is actually kind of sad," she said. "You could have at least bought something from Amazon like normal people." Daniel let out a quiet breath through his nose. Not quite laughter, not quite disagreement either. I noticed the grandfather clock in the corner tick softly into the silence that followed. Tick, tick, tick. My late husband Walter used to wind that clock every Sunday morning before church. He always said a house could tell when people stopped respecting each other. Funny the things you remembered during moments like that. "I made it myself," I said. Vanessa placed the snow globe back onto the tablecloth beside the cranberry sauce dish like it was something cheap from a gas station shelf. "Well," she said brightly, lifting her wine glass, "it definitely looks homemade." More laughter. Softer this time. Careful. Embarrassed. The kind people use when they know something has crossed the line, but they keep smiling anyway, because Christmas dinner is easier than honesty. I glanced toward the tree standing beside the fireplace. Gold ribbon. White lights. Crystal ornaments. Expensive gifts stacked neatly underneath in shiny paper with oversized bows Vanessa insisted made the room look luxury magazine worthy. Beneath all that sparkle sat a plain ivory envelope with Daniel's name written carefully across the front in my handwriting. Vanessa hadn't noticed it yet. None of them had. I smiled quietly to myself and reached for my fork again while the grandfather clock continued counting down the seconds. Because by then, I already knew something they didn't. That house had never belonged to them. Dinner continued after that, but nobody touched the snow globe again. It sat near the center of the table beneath the soft yellow light of the chandelier, while conversations drifted around it awkwardly, like people trying to step around a puddle without acknowledging it was there. Vanessa immediately moved on to talking about kitchen renovations she wanted finished before New Year's Day. Marble countertops, imported cabinet handles, a 6-burner Italian gas range she claimed would finally make the house feel modern. Every few minutes, she referred to the house as if she already owned it completely. "When we redo the downstairs flooring," she said while cutting into her ham, "I think we should remove all this dark wood. It makes the place feel old." I glanced toward the walnut trim running along the walls. Walter had installed every piece himself during the winter of 1989 after working double shifts at the steel plant for nearly 6 months. I still remembered him standing on a ladder in thick wool socks because the furnace had gone out that December and we could not afford repairs until February. He had measured each board twice before cutting it because wasting wood meant wasting money. Back then, this house was not about appearances. It was survival, family, sacrifice. Now Vanessa talked about it the way people talk about outdated furniture in a vacation rental. And honestly, she continued with a laugh, the basement needs to be cleared out too. There is just so much old stuff down there. Daniel nodded quietly while scrolling through something on his phone. "We can probably rent a dumpster after New Year's." Old stuff. I lowered my eyes toward my plate before anyone noticed the expression on my face. My sewing machine was downstairs. Walter's fishing rods were downstairs. Boxes of Christmas ornaments the children made in elementary school were downstairs. 43 years of my life had slowly been relocated beneath the house like things people planned to forget later. Emily suddenly spoke up from beside the fireplace. Grandma's ornaments are my favorite ones on the tree. Vanessa gave a tight smile without looking at her daughter. Sweetheart, those are very old. That is why I like them, Emily answered softly. For a moment, nobody said anything. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Tick, tick, tick. Vanessa reached for her wine again. Well, some things are sentimental, she said carefully, and some things just take up space. Daniel finally looked up then, though not at me. Mom, he said casually, Vanessa and I were actually thinking maybe after the holidays you could move into the downstairs guest room permanently. That way Emily can use your room when we renovate the upstairs office. I stared at him for a moment, honestly unsure whether I had heard him correctly. My room. The master bedroom Walter and I had shared since 1983. The room where I held his hand during the final weeks before cancer took him. The room where every closet shelf still smelled faintly of cedar and his aftershave. Vanessa quickly jumped in before the silence became uncomfortable. It would just make more sense long term, she explained brightly. The stairs are getting harder for you anyway. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my untouched pie plate. I still manage the stairs just fine. For now, Vanessa replied. The words landed softly, but there was steel underneath them. Across the room, Emily lowered her eyes while Tyler continued staring at his tablet, barely listening. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly and reached for another drink. Nobody defended me. Nobody even looked surprised. That was the moment I realized this conversation had happened before tonight. Quietly, privately, probably many times. They had already rearranged my future together while I was still living inside it. I stood carefully from the table and carried my plate into the kitchen before my hands started trembling badly enough for someone to notice. From the sink window, I could see snow collecting along the backyard fence Walter built the summer Daniel turned 10 years old. The fence leaned slightly now after all these years, but it still stood. Funny how the things built with love usually lasted longer than the people who tried replacing them. Behind me, laughter slowly returned to the dining room. Vanessa's voice rose above the others again, cheerful and polished, already moving on from the conversation as if she had merely suggested changing curtains instead of quietly pushing an old woman out of her own life. I rested one hand against the kitchen counter and looked toward the small ivory envelope still sitting untouched beneath the Christmas tree. Then I smiled very softly to myself, because Walter had prepared for this long before any of them realized. The house always felt different after midnight on Christmas Eve. Quieter, almost honest. By 11:30, the dishes had been stacked in the sink, wrapping paper had collected in glossy piles near the fireplace, and Vanessa finally stopped performing happiness long enough to complain about being tired. Daniel helped carry leftovers into the kitchen while Tyler disappeared upstairs with his new gaming headset still around his neck. Emily lingered near the tree for a while, gently touching the lower branches with her fingertips before Vanessa called her upstairs too. Soon the entire house settled into silence except for the low hum of the furnace and the soft ticking of Walter's clock in the corner. I stayed behind in the living room pretending to organize ribbons and gift bags long after everyone else had gone upstairs. The truth was, I simply was not ready to enter my bedroom yet. Not after what Daniel had said at dinner. Your room. Such a small sentence. Funny how certain words can make a familiar place suddenly feel borrowed. I sat slowly in Walter's old armchair beside the fireplace and stared at the Christmas tree lights blinking softly across the darkened room. Years ago, Daniel used to sleep under this tree on Christmas Eve because he was too excited to wait until morning. Walter would carry him upstairs around midnight with one arm while holding a mug of hot cocoa in the other. Back then, this house sounded different during the holidays. Louder, warmer, full of footsteps and burnt cookie trays and children arguing over ornaments. Now every room felt careful, controlled, like everyone was quietly waiting for me to disappear so the house could finally become theirs without guilt attached to it. I do not know how long I sat there before I heard footsteps overhead. Slow ones this time. Adult footsteps. A door closed softly upstairs, followed by muffled voices. Vanessa and Daniel. At first I tried not to listen, but then I heard my name. She is going to make this difficult, Vanessa whispered sharply. We should have handled this months ago. I remained perfectly still in the chair. Just give it time, Daniel answered quietly. After the holidays, things will settle down. Daniel, she still thinks this is her house. Silence followed that sentence. Heavy silence. The kind that tells you more than words ever could. I looked toward the staircase, but did not move. We already talked about this, Daniel finally said. The realtor said spring is the best time to list it. Realtor. My fingers tightened slowly around the edge of Walter's blanket resting across my lap. Exactly, Vanessa replied. Which means she needs to be downstairs permanently before then. Nobody wants to tour a house with an old woman wandering around in slippers. I closed my eyes for a moment after hearing that. Not because I was shocked anymore. Shock had already passed sometime during dinner. What remained now was something colder. Clearer. The furnace clicked on again, blowing warm air through the vents while snow tapped lightly against the living room windows outside. Upstairs, Vanessa continued speaking in that polished voice she used whenever she wanted something badly enough. And honestly, Daniel, your father would have wanted you to move forward. This place is too big for her anyway. Your father, not Walter. Never Walter. She always spoke about him like he was a distant relative instead of the man who built every inch of this life with his own hands. I know, Daniel murmured tiredly. I just do not want drama on Christmas. Vanessa laughed quietly after that. Then maybe she should stop acting sentimental about everything. Their bedroom door shut a few seconds later, and the house became silent again. I stared at the tree lights reflecting against the front windows while Walter's clock continued ticking steadily beside me. Tick, tick, tick. For the first time all evening, I reached down and picked up the ivory envelope from beneath the tree. My handwriting looked small against the cream-colored paper. Daniel Whitmore. I turned the envelope over carefully in my hands and ran my thumb across the sealed edge. Walter had prepared these documents almost 2 years before he died. Back then, I thought he was being overly cautious. People change when money and property get involved. He told me one rainy afternoon while sitting at the kitchen table with stacks of paperwork spread between us. Promise me you will not ignore the warning signs when they come. At the time, I laughed and told him our family was stronger than that. Tonight, sitting alone beside the dying firelight while my son planned my removal upstairs, I finally understood why Walter never laughed back. I barely slept that night. Around 4 a.m, I gave up trying and walked quietly downstairs in my robe while the rest of the house remained dark and silent. The Christmas tree lights still glowed softly in the living room, reflecting against the hardwood floors Walter spent 2 summers refinishing by hand after Daniel left for college. I moved slowly through the kitchen, filling the old kettle from the sink, while snow continued falling outside in thick white sheets. Ohio winters always carried a certain silence with them, the kind that made every memory feel louder. As the water heated on the stove, I found myself staring toward the back hallway where Walter used to hang his work jacket every evening. Even now, 2 years after his funeral, I still expected to hear the sound of his boots crossing the tile floor sometimes. Funny how grief works like that. People think it arrives all at once, like a storm, but really it lingers quietly inside ordinary moments. A coffee mug left untouched. An empty chair. The side of the bed that stays cold. I wrapped both hands around my teacup and carried it into Walter's study, closing the door gently behind me. Vanessa hated this room. She called it cluttered and outdated because Walter never believed in throwing useful things away. The walls still held shelves of old accounting books, faded family photographs, and the small wooden radio he repaired every winter just to keep his hands busy. Dust floated through the pale morning light near the windows while the scent of cedar and old paper filled the room. I sat carefully behind Walter's desk and opened the bottom drawer where I had hidden the duplicate copies of the trust documents after his death. The envelope looked exactly the same as it had 2 years ago. Thick cream-colored paper. Harold Green's law office stamped neatly across the corner. My fingers rested against it for a long moment before I opened it again. Walter always handled the finances in our marriage. Not because he believed I could not, but because numbers calmed him. Spreadsheets. Tax records. Mortgage payments. He trusted order more than emotion. During the final year of his illness, He became unusually quiet whenever Daniel and Vanessa visited. At first, I blamed the medication. Then one afternoon, while we sat together on the back porch watching snow fall across the yard, he finally told me the truth. Vanessa does not look at this house like a home, he said softly. She looks at it like inventory. I remember feeling defensive immediately. I told him he was being unfair. Vanessa could certainly be controlling sometimes, but she was family. Walter only nodded slowly and stared toward the fence line while rubbing his wedding band between his fingers. Maybe I am wrong, he said. But if I am not, I need to know you will be protected after I am gone. A week later, he insisted we meet with Harold Green privately. I still remembered that rainy Thursday afternoon clearly. Walter walked slower by then, his breathing shallow beneath his wool coat, but his mind remained sharp. Harold spread stacks of paperwork across the conference table while Walter explained exactly how he wanted the estate structured. The house, the land, the accounts. Everything placed into a protected family trust solely under my control unless I personally chose otherwise. Daniel will inherit eventually, Walter explained calmly, but not before Margaret is gone, and not through pressure or manipulation. I laughed uncomfortably during that meeting because the conversation felt dramatic at the time. Nobody is manipulating anyone, I remember saying. Walter looked at me then with such sadness in his eyes that it silenced me completely. Margaret, he said quietly, love can make people generous. Grief can make them vulnerable. But entitlement changes people faster than almost anything else I have ever seen. Sitting alone in his study Christmas morning, I finally understood every word. Upstairs, I heard footsteps beginning overhead as the house slowly woke. Cabinet doors opening, water running through pipes. Vanessa's voice faintly calling for coffee. I closed the folder carefully and slid it back into the drawer before standing slowly from the desk. Then I caught my reflection briefly in the dark window beside Walter's bookshelf. Silver hair slightly messy from sleep. Wrinkles deeper than they used to be. Tired eyes. But something else too. Something steadier than yesterday. Because for the first time since Walter died, I realized I was not the helpless old woman Vanessa believed she was managing. I was the woman Walter trusted to finish what he started. Christmas morning arrived gray and heavy beneath a sky full of slow-moving snow clouds. By 8 o'clock, the smell of cinnamon rolls and bacon drifted through the kitchen, while Vanessa moved around the house in matching holiday pajamas she had bought for everyone except me. Emily noticed immediately, of course. Children always notice the things adults pretend are accidental. Grandma did not get a matching set, she said quietly while sitting at the counter with a mug of hot chocolate in both hands. Vanessa barely looked up from arranging fruit on a serving tray. Oh, I must have forgotten to order hers. Forgotten. Such a convenient word. I stood near the coffee maker pouring cream into my cup as if I had not heard her at all. Daniel walked into the kitchen a few moments later wearing red plaid pajama pants and carrying his phone already in his hand. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek absent-mindedly before opening the refrigerator. Nobody noticed Emily watching all of it carefully from her stool beside the island. Mom, Daniel said casually while scrolling through emails. We are having a few people over around noon for brunch. Just neighbors and some friends from Vanessa's yoga studio. I nodded once. That sounds nice. Vanessa placed polished silverware carefully beside the plates lined across the dining room table. Try not to bring up politics or family stories from the 70s this year, she added with a small laugh. Last Thanksgiving got a little awkward. Daniel smiled weakly at the floor while reaching for orange juice. I simply stirred my coffee slowly. Walter always used to say that humiliation works best when disguised as humor because it gives cowards somewhere to hide afterward. Around 10 o'clock, the house became louder. Christmas music floated through ceiling speakers while Vanessa rushed around adjusting candles and fluffing decorative pillows as if a magazine photographer might arrive any second. Guests soon followed carrying wine bottles, bakery boxes, and expensive winter coats dusted with snowflakes. I stayed mostly near the fireplace, quietly folding discarded tissue paper and straightening ornaments children had knocked sideways. People greeted me politely enough, though several of Vanessa's friends spoke to me in the careful, overly cheerful voice people use with elderly strangers in waiting rooms. Your son and daughter-in-law have done such amazing things with this house, one woman said admiringly while looking around the living room. It must be nice seeing younger people breathe fresh life into an older property. Older property. I smiled faintly and adjusted the ribbon on one of the tree branches. Across the room, Vanessa laughed loudly at something another guest said before glancing briefly toward me with satisfaction in her eyes. She enjoyed these moments. The subtle little reductions. Turning a woman into background decoration inside her own home one sentence at a time. Around noon, Emily quietly slipped beside me near the staircase while everyone crowded around the brunch table. "Grandma," she whispered nervously, "can I show you something?" Her voice sounded so serious that I immediately followed her upstairs without asking questions. She led me into her bedroom and carefully closed the door behind us before reaching beneath her bed for a small pink backpack. "I was not trying to snoop," she said quickly, already looking guilty. "But Mom left these papers in the office and I heard them talking last night." My stomach tightened slightly as she handed me several folded sheets from inside the bag. Real estate listings, contractor estimates, renovation plans. My eyes moved slowly across highlighted notes written in Vanessa's neat handwriting. Convert downstairs into guest suite before spring listing. Remove outdated furniture. Stage master bedroom after relocation. Relocation. Not move. Not transition. Relocation. Like I was office equipment. Emily watched my face nervously while twisting the sleeve of her sweater between her fingers. "Grandma," she whispered softly, "are they making you leave?" I looked down at her then. 12 years old. Thin blonde braid hanging over one shoulder. Walter's gentle. Eyes staring back at me with more honesty than anyone else in this house. For a moment, I could not speak at all. Finally, I reached forward and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear the same way I used to do for Daniel when he was little. "No, sweetheart," I said quietly. "Nobody is making me leave." Downstairs, laughter echoed through the house again, while dishes clinked and Christmas music played softly through the speakers. Emily hesitated before pulling something else from the backpack. A silver key attached to a small leather tag. I recognized it immediately. Walter's private filing cabinet key. "I found this in Grandpa's old desk," she whispered. "Mom was looking for it yesterday." I closed my fingers slowly around the cool metal key while the grandfather clock downstairs chimed noon through the floorboards beneath our feet. And for the first time since Walter died, I realized the balance inside this house had already begun to shift. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a performance everyone already knew by heart. Vanessa floated through the house balancing champagne glasses and compliments while Daniel followed behind her carrying serving trays and apologizing whenever someone needed more chairs. Christmas music drifted softly from the speakers, mixing with bursts of laughter and the steady clink of silverware against expensive plates. From the outside, we probably looked like the perfect family. Warm home, beautiful decorations, successful son, elegant daughter-in-law. Nobody would have noticed the old woman standing quietly near the fireplace, holding a cup of untouched coffee long gone cold in her hands. I kept Emily's backpack hidden upstairs beneath my bed while the papers inside replayed through my mind over and over again. Stage master bedroom after relocation. The words no longer hurt the way they had earlier. Hurt requires surprise. What I felt now was clarity. Around 2 o'clock, Vanessa gathered everyone into the living room for what she called the real gifts. Her voice carried brightly across the house while guests settled onto couches and armchairs with wine glasses balanced carefully in their hands. I remained near Walter's chair, beside the fireplace while snow continued falling steadily outside the windows. Vanessa handed Daniel a long rectangular box first. Inside was a designer watch that several people immediately admired. Then Tyler opened a new gaming console and practically shouted with excitement before running upstairs to set it up. Emily received art supplies and hugged her mother politely, though her eyes drifted toward me almost immediately afterward. Finally, Vanessa reached beneath the tree and lifted the ivory envelope I had left there the night before. "Oh," she laughed lightly while turning it over in her hands. "I almost forgot this one." Daniel looked mildly confused when she handed it to him. "For Mom?" he asked. I nodded once. "Open it later," I said calmly. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Now I am curious." Before Daniel could answer, she slid one manicured finger beneath the seal and opened the envelope herself. Several folded documents slipped into her lap. At first her smile remained perfectly in place. Then I watched it slowly disappear. The room quieted almost immediately after that. Vanessa unfolded the first page completely while Daniel leaned closer beside her. I noticed his expression change too. Confusion first, then disbelief. "What is this?" Vanessa asked quietly. Nobody answered right away. I set my coffee cup carefully onto the side table beside Walter's chair before finally speaking. "Those are copies of the trust documents Walter established before he passed away." Vanessa stared down at the papers again. "This says the house ownership transferred entirely into protected trust management." Her voice sounded tighter now, less polished. "Yes," I replied softly. "Under my authority." Daniel blinked several times while rereading the pages. "Mom, there has to be some mistake." "No," I said calmly. "There is not." The room had become completely silent by then except for the faint crackling of the fireplace and the grandfather clock ticking steadily near the staircase. Several guests shifted uncomfortably on the couches without saying a word. Vanessa's face lost color as she flipped quickly through the remaining pages. "This cannot be right," she whispered sharply toward Daniel. "Your father told us this house would eventually belong to you." "Eventually," I repeated quietly. "After my death. Not before." Daniel looked at me then with an expression I had not seen on his face since childhood. Fear. Real fear. "Mom," he began carefully, "why are you showing us this now?" I held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "Because last night I heard my relocation plans being discussed upstairs while I sat alone downstairs in the home your father built." Vanessa immediately straightened. "You were listening to private conversations?" The audacity of the question almost made me smile. "Almost." "You were planning to remove me from my own bedroom before spring," I answered calmly. I believe privacy stopped mattering somewhere around that point. Nobody moved. Nobody defended them. Across the room, one of Vanessa's friends quietly set down her wine glass while another stared fixedly at the Christmas tree as if hoping not to become part of the moment. Daniel lowered himself slowly onto the edge of the couch while rubbing one hand across his forehead. "Mom," he said quietly, "we were only trying to make things practical long-term." Practical. Another convenient word. I glanced toward the snow globe still sitting untouched near the center of the dining room table visible through the doorway. Tiny white flakes rested peacefully around the little farmhouse inside. "Your father used to say practical people often become cruel without realizing it," I said softly. Then I looked directly at Vanessa for the first time all day. "And cruel people usually mistake silence for weakness." Vanessa recovered faster than I expected. That was the thing about people like her. They rarely collapsed completely in public. Instead, they adjusted their posture, fixed their expression, and searched for a way to regain control before anyone noticed the panic underneath. She carefully stacked the papers back into the envelope and placed it onto the coffee table with a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "Well," she said lightly, glancing around the room toward the guests. This certainly became dramatic. A few nervous chuckles floated weakly through the living room, but nobody sounded comfortable anymore. Daniel remained seated on the edge of the couch, staring at the floor while rubbing both hands together slowly. I had seen that habit before. He did it as a child whenever he knew he had disappointed Walter. "Mom," he said quietly without looking up, "we never wanted you to feel pushed out." I folded my hands loosely in front of me and looked toward the Christmas tree lights glowing softly against the windows. "That is interesting," I replied calmly, "because I distinctly remember hearing renovation plans for my bedroom before anyone discussed them with me." Vanessa crossed her arms immediately. "We were trying to plan ahead responsibly. That is what adults do." "Adults also speak honestly," I answered, "usually before assigning someone to the basement like extra furniture." The silence afterwards stretched long enough for the grandfather clock to tick 4 full times. Tick, 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 tick. One of the guests quietly stood and carried her empty plate into the kitchen without a word. Another pretended to check messages on his phone while avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. Christmas music still played softly from the speakers overhead, though now the cheerful voices sounded almost eerie against the tension filling the house. Vanessa finally sat down beside Daniel and lowered her voice. "Margaret, I think you are overreacting emotionally because of the holidays." Emotionally. Another carefully chosen word. I smiled faintly at that. "Walter prepared these documents 2 years before his death," I said. "Long before this Christmas. Long before your relocation plans." Long before you began calling my home an outdated property. Daniel lifted his head sharply. Dad knew. I looked at my son for a long moment before answering quietly. Your father understood people better than I did. That landed harder than anger ever could have. Daniel leaned back against the couch cushions slowly, as if the weight of the room had suddenly become too heavy to carry upright. Across the room, Emily sat silently near the staircase, clutching her mug of cocoa with both hands while watching her parents. Carefully, Tyler still had not come back downstairs since opening his gifts earlier. Honestly, I was grateful for that. Children should not have to witness adults shrinking themselves over greed. Vanessa exhaled sharply through her nose before straightening again. Fine, she said. Since everything is apparently out in the open now, let us be practical. What exactly are you planning to do? The question hung in the room like smoke. Outside the windows, snow continued falling steadily across the yard Walter spent years maintaining by hand every spring and summer. I remembered him planting the maple tree near the driveway the year Emily was born. I remembered him teaching Daniel how to patch drywall in the upstairs hallway after a baseball accident. Every inch of this house carried fingerprints of love no renovation plan could erase. I am planning to stay in my home, I answered simply. Vanessa laughed once under her breath, though there was very little humor left in it now. You cannot seriously expect all of us to keep living like this after today. Like what? I asked softly, aware of the truth. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Please stop. It was the first genuinely emotional thing he had said all afternoon. Vanessa turned toward him immediately. Daniel, do not start feeling guilty now. We have done nothing wrong. I watched my son carefully then. Watched the exhaustion settling across his face. The uncertainty. The embarrassment. Walter used to say that some people lose themselves all at once while others disappear slowly through 1,000 small compromises they barely notice happening. Looking at Daniel now, I realized my husband had been watching that process begin years ago. Suddenly, the front doorbell rang sharply through the house. Everyone looked toward the entryway at once. Vanessa frowned. Who else is coming? She muttered. But I already knew. I rose slowly from Walter's chair and smoothed the front of my sweater calmly before walking toward the foyer. Behind me, the room remained silent except for the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft crackle of the fire. When I opened the front door, Harold Green stood beneath the porch. Light holding a leather briefcase dusted lightly with snow. Harold Green stepped inside, stamping snow carefully from his polished shoes before removing his dark wool coat. At 73, Harold still carried himself with the calm precision of a man who had spent 40 years delivering difficult truths inside quiet offices. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and he held Walter's leather briefcase tucked beneath one arm exactly the way my husband used to carry it after meetings downtown. For one strange moment, seeing that briefcase again nearly knocked the breath from my chest. Harold looked around the living room slowly, immediately sensing the tension hanging over every inch of the house. I apologize for arriving unannounced on Christmas, he said politely. Margaret asked me to stop by regarding some family documents. Nobody answered him. Vanessa remained frozen on the couch with the trust papers still resting in her lap, while Daniel stared toward Harold with growing confusion. Mr. Green, Daniel finally said carefully, what exactly is going on here? Harold placed the briefcase gently onto the dining room table before opening the brass clasps with deliberate calm. Your father requested very specific legal protections before his passing, he explained. Protections that become relevant if Mrs. Whitmore's residency, authority, or well-being inside this home is challenged. Vanessa immediately stood. Nobody challenged her well-being. Harold glanced toward her only briefly. I believe discussing basement relocation plans while preparing property listings qualifies as relevant. The room went silent again. I watched Daniel's face carefully as realization slowly settled across it piece by piece. Not sudden, not explosive, just heavy, like watching a man finally understand how far he drifted from himself without noticing. Harold removed several folders from the briefcase and spread them neatly across the dining room table beneath the chandelier light. Walter anticipated potential pressure involving the property after his death, he continued calmly. Therefore, he established a conditional family trust placing all ownership authority solely under Margaret Whitmore. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. You already said that. Harold nodded once. What has not yet been explained is the enforcement clause. That got everyone's attention immediately. Even the guests still lingering awkwardly near the kitchen doorway looked up. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the darkening afternoon, while Christmas lights reflected warmly against the windows. Inside, the house felt colder with every passing minute. Harold adjusted his glasses slightly before continuing. Under the terms of the trust, any resident attempting to manipulate, pressure, displace, or financially exploit Mrs. Whitmore forfeits all future inheritance rights connected to the property and estate assets. Daniel looked up sharply. What? Harold slid one document toward him. Your father insisted on this condition personally. Daniel stared down at the page with visible disbelief, while Vanessa immediately stepped closer beside him. This is insane, she snapped. You cannot just take away someone's inheritance because of a misunderstanding. Harold's expression never changed. Legally speaking, this is not a misunderstanding. There are documented witness statements, recorded financial consultations, and relocation preparations already in motion. I noticed Vanessa's face pale slightly at the word recorded. Walter truly had seen farther ahead than I ever imagined. Dad did this, Daniel whispered quietly while staring at the papers. Harold softened slightly then. Your father loved you very much, he said gently. But he also loved your mother enough to make certain she would never become vulnerable inside her own home. That sentence broke something open inside the room. Daniel leaned back heavily against the couch cushions and covered part of his face with one hand. For the first time all day, he looked less defensive than ashamed. Vanessa, however, moved in the opposite direction entirely. This is manipulation, she said sharply toward me. You waited until Christmas to humiliate us in front of everyone. I looked at her calmly across the room. No, Vanessa. I waited until Christmas because you chose Christmas to finalize my removal. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Across the staircase, Emily remained perfectly still while clutching the railing quietly with both hands. Harold reached into the briefcase one final time before removing another sealed envelope. There is one additional matter, he said. Daniel lowered his hands slowly from his face. Harold placed the envelope carefully onto the table between us all. Effective immediately, Margaret Whitmore has requested formal termination of residency privileges for any adult resident found acting against trust protections. Vanessa stared at him blankly for a second before realization hit her completely. You cannot be serious. Harold met her eyes calmly. Mrs. Whitmore has every legal right to request your departure from the property. The silence afterward felt enormous. No Christmas music. No laughter. No clinking glasses. Only the steady ticking of Walter's grandfather clock echoing through the house he spent his entire life protecting. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Harold finished explaining the eviction notice. The silence settled across the house like fresh snow, heavy and impossible to ignore. Vanessa stood perfectly still beside the dining room table, staring at the envelope, as if refusing to fully understand what it meant. Daniel looked exhausted now, older somehow. The kind of tired that comes from realizing too late that you crossed lines you never thought you would. One by one, the remaining guests quietly gathered their coats and offered awkward holiday goodbyes before slipping out into the snowy evening without meeting anyone's eyes directly. The front door opened and closed softly several times until only family remained inside the house again. Christmas music had stopped at some point, though I could not remember exactly when. The tree lights still glowed warmly against the darkened windows, but the room itself felt stripped bare now. Honest. Harold carefully organized the remaining documents back into Walter's leather briefcase before standing beside me near the fireplace. I will leave copies for everyone, he said gently. And I recommend no further discussions tonight. Daniel nodded slowly without lifting his eyes. Vanessa finally looked toward me then, though the confidence she carried all afternoon had disappeared completely. So that is it? She asked quietly. You are throwing us out on Christmas? I studied her face for a long moment before answering. No, Vanessa. I am refusing to disappear quietly. She opened her mouth as if preparing another argument, but nothing came out this time. Perhaps because deep down she already knew the truth. This was never really about one conversation or one Christmas dinner. It was years of small humiliations finally reaching their natural ending. Harold placed one hand gently against my shoulder before heading toward the foyer to collect his coat. Walter would be proud of you, he said softly before leaving. After the front door closed behind him, snow continued falling quietly outside while the grandfather clock echoed through the silence once more. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel finally stood from the couch and walked slowly toward the fireplace. For several seconds, he simply stared into the flames without speaking. I did not see it happening, he admitted quietly. At least not at first. I remained seated in Walter's chair with my hands folded calmly in my lap. That is usually how these things happen, I said. Little compromises. Little silences. He nodded faintly while rubbing his wedding band between his fingers the same way Walter used to do when something troubled him deeply. Dad warned me once, he whispered almost to himself, about letting people make decisions for me. Across the room, Vanessa looked away sharply. Do not put this all on me, Daniel. He did not answer her immediately. Instead, he looked slowly around the living room. At the old ornaments hanging unevenly on the tree. At the walnut trim Walter installed decades ago. At the family photographs lining the mantel above the fireplace. I watched realization move across his face piece by piece. Not about the house itself. About everything he stopped noticing over the years while chasing comfort and avoiding conflict. Emily quietly walked downstairs, then carrying the handmade snow globe in both hands. She crossed the room carefully before placing it onto the side table beside me. I like this one the best, she said softly. For the first time all day, I felt my throat tighten slightly. I reached over and brushed my fingers gently against her cheek, while tiny white flakes drifted peacefully inside the globe beneath the warm glow of the Christmas lights. Vanessa grabbed her purse abruptly from the kitchen counter a few moments later. I cannot stay here tonight, she muttered while pulling on her coat. Daniel looked toward her, but did not move. Where are you going? To my sister's. Her voice sounded brittle now. Thin. She waited as if expecting him to follow immediately, but he stayed exactly where he was beside the fireplace. After a long, uncomfortable pause, she finally walked out the front door alone into the falling snow. The sound of her car starting echoed faintly through the quiet street a minute later before disappearing completely. Daniel remained standing there for a long time afterward without speaking. Finally, he looked toward me with red, tired eyes that suddenly reminded me of the little boy who used to sleep beneath this very Christmas tree, waiting for morning. I am sorry, Mom, he whispered. And this time, I believed he meant it. Later that night, after everyone finally went upstairs, I stayed alone beside the fireplace, holding the snow globe carefully in my hands while snow continued falling beyond the windows. The house felt different now. Still quiet. Still grieving in its own way. But no longer afraid. I looked toward Walter's clock standing tall in the corner exactly where he left it and listened to the steady rhythm filling the room. Tick, tick, tick. Then I smiled softly to myself for the very first time that Christmas. Because after years of slowly becoming invisible inside my own life, I was finally home again.